Today on This Week in Iowa, public money for private schools. We hear from concerned parents how the governor's scholarship program will impact urban and rural schools, and a deep dive into proposed education budgets, why Republicans say it's all there is to give. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us here for This Week in Iowa. I'm Sabrina Ahmed. A bill that would give public money to private schools for up to 10,000 children passed the Senate this week. Families that earn less than 400% of the federal poverty line would be eligible for these vouchers. That means a family of 5 would be eligible if they make less than $130,000. In addition to the voucher program, this bill that passed the Senate also requires school districts to publish all their instructional materials online. Critics of the legislation say it would add more stress for teachers. The vouchers bill has stalled in the Iowa House, however, but the governor wants the House and the Senate to work together to increase what she says is school choice. But that transparency portion of the bill has already made it through the House this week. Among other things, that bill that passed the House would require a district or charter school, but not a private school, to provide a list of library books available at the library and give procedures to request removing a book that's available. Districts must make all textbooks, course syllabi, and a list of instructional materials used on the website. A previous version only allowed teachers to update that list of materials twice a year, but now teachers can modify whenever they need, and the district has 7 days to then update the website. That bill gives school districts 2 years to be in compliance. The Iowa House also passed their education budget this week. Included in that budget is a 2.5% increase in per pupil funding. No increase for the region's universities, but then adds a $12 million pot of money for scholarships for students who are going into high needs fields. So I spoke to the chair of the Appropriations Committee, John Wills, about the education budget and vouchers bill in the House. He says although a majority of the burden is not on counties anymore, it's now on the state to provide school funding, he thinks funding for these schools is enough.
Way before my time in the legislature, the shift was, it was property tax. This was the primary means for school funding. What happened though, back in probably the 70s and maybe early 80s, they looked at that and said, that's not very equitable. So the lower income areas or maybe even blighted communities, the property tax weren't able to keep up, weren't able to provide the same amount of funding for, say, West Des Moines kind of areas. And so what we're seeing is we weren't seeing equity in education. And so they came up with this funding formula statewide that a lot of the funding would come from the general fund of the state government and kind of take over the primary source of funding from the property tax funding. And so that's kind of how we got to where we are, just in equity. So right now we're paying about $6,500 per child from the state. And from the federal government, we're seeing about $10,000 per student average. And then from property tax, we're seeing in between $1,000, $1,300 and $3,000 from property tax. So over $17,000 per child is going into our public education system right now.
I'd like to talk about a proposal that has been moved to the Appropriations Committee, which is these school scholarships. It's essentially public money going to fund private schools through scholarships for up to 10,000 students who are at 400% of the poverty level. Can you talk to me about, first of all, kind of encompass what is this bill? What does it do now that it's in appropriations? I know you also sit on the Education Committee. And then where does it lie? It's stalled, but it's moved to another committee, so it's still alive?
Right. Well, really, we have some good things happening with it right now. As we work and we listen to the members in the House to try and understand if they have an opposition, what is the opposition? If they don't have an opposition, where are they at, and that sort of thing. And so we're trying to really listen to the members, understand what we need to do to make this bill a better bill. And so we always want to look at, and this is exactly the process that we go through for every bill, but we always want to look at how can we make this bill a better bill overall, addressing the needs of our members, addressing the needs of the folks that are here, and at the same time, get a very substantial, substantive bill that would mean a lot to our kids, to our parents, because really, in the end, we want to get away from funding institutions and fund the child. We want to make sure that the child is the one that's of primary importance in this situation.
When I've spoken to parents and some educators and as well as lawmakers, the concern is that these rural communities that maybe have a private school but aren't big enough to have a lot of funds coming into their district, then they perhaps will hurt from this, that this money is directly leaving these already hurting schools and going to schools that are privately funded that don't have the same accountability as public schools. I mean, just for example, the piece of legislation that just passed for transparency in education doesn't apply to private schools.
Right. Well, and I understand those arguments, and I'll try to touch on those points in separate comments. First of all, there's data that shows that when a student goes to a private school, it helps all three. It helps the private school, it helps the child, and it helps the public school. You're taking that child away from that public school, sending them to a private school, but at the same time, that remember I just talked about the $10,000 or $1,300 and the $6,500. Well, the $10,000 and the $1,300 stay with the school, so they're able to keep that money, and they don't have a child to educate, so they can focus that money on other kids and provide extra services to those other kids, keep the same teachers, that sort of thing. The child is benefited because they get a better education. Oftentimes, they get an education that can be fine-tuned to them, maybe smaller class sizes and all kinds of things. And that is also benefited because they're having a higher enrollment. And so it really benefits the data. Peer-reviewed studies actually show that all three entities really do get better and improve because of that. So I can't remember the second question you had, so I'm sorry.
It was just to the point that they don't have the same level of transparency requirements as the public schools do.
Yeah, so the bill that we have in front of us deals only with accredited schools. So these schools are accredited. They have to meet certain standards. They have to meet certain criteria. And I would really say, back to folks that say that, even though these are accredited schools, I'm a local control kind of person. I like to see local control. I like as local as possible. What is more local control than a parent? And who really needs to be accountable for that child's education other than the parent? And so as long as the parent's satisfied, that's the accountability I like to see. But I would even counter and say these schools are accredited. They have to meet certain standards in order to be accredited. And so I think that they're fully accountable to those students and to the parents.
Coming up on This Week in Iowa, three moms are working together to protect public schools. Their concerns about the voucher proposal is next. This morning, we are joined by Parents for Great Iowa Schools. Louisa Dykstra, Rose Green, and Shanda Karstens, thank you so much for being with me. Three moms lobbying at the State House to promote public education. To get started, we just listened to the conversation with Representative John Wills, and I was watching your reaction, and Representative Wills mentioned $10,000 per student coming in from the federal government to help fund schools, and you have an issue with that statement.
Yeah, I think just simply put, most of the federal investment in schools is specific to special ed. So $10,000 per every child is not an accurate number.
So let's talk about one of the other topics that Representative Wills and I were having a conversation about, and that was those school vouchers. They've passed the Iowa Senate. They are stalled, but in appropriations in the Iowa House, meaning they could still go. What are your thoughts, ladies, on paying for private schools through public dollars?
I could go ahead.
Go ahead, Rose.
First off, I think school choice is a little bit of a misnomer because I don't really think that the schools, that families can really choose the schools choose the families, because unlike in a public school, you have to apply to get into a private school. So to say that it's an ultimate freedom that you can choose any school that you want to, schools can turn children away. Like Louisa had mentioned, if you have special education needs that they can't be met, if there are behavioral issues, some children just don't get admitted to school. So from the start, it's a little bit of a misnomer.
If I can just add one thing to that, even if they're initially accepted, they might be counseled out or expelled from the school. And in that case with this bill, the parent is on the hook to pay back the money that they initially got from the state and gave to the private school. The private school doesn't give that back, but the parent is on the hook to pay that back to the state. So we could be setting up families for a really disastrous situation.
Families with children who might have higher needs. And another thing we talked about with Representative Wills is there is no accountability necessarily for these private schools. They don't have to accept anyone.
Right, and even the legislation is written that says that no undue burden shall be placed on the private school as a result of this voucher. And it's just really frustrating as a parent in a public school when I look at the list of regulations and the tests and the reporting that our kids have to do, and to know that for that same, in exchange for that same amount of taxpayer money, that private schools wouldn't have any of those accountability measures. And those accountability measures take away from learning and experience in our kids' community, in our kids' schools.
So what is your request of lawmakers when they are considering this piece of voucher legislation in the State House, and although it's already passed the Senate, you know, in the Senate as well?
I think it's so ironic that in the same bill in the Senate is the increasing the transparency requirements for public schools and explicitly stating like there are no requirements for private schools implied in this bill. We've lost sight of what a private school is and what a public school is, that taxpayers provide public schools.
And also, I think fair is fair. And so if you are going to accept this $6,000 or $7,000, you know, to follow your child to the school of your choice, then we should all be operating under the same rules.
Okay, we're going to continue this conversation with Parents for Great Iowa Schools here in just a few minutes. Shanda, we are going to get to you and talk all about rural schools as a rural parent. So we'll continue this conversation with these moms coming up in just a few minutes. So stay with us, everyone. We're continuing our conversation with Parents for Great Iowa Schools. We've talked a little bit about vouchers, but I think it's important, we would be remiss not to mention the fact that there are already scholarships for private schools that are publicly funded in our state. What is that program?
I can talk to that. It's commonly called the STO, and it's the School Tuition Organization. And it's the allocation is now set to be at $20 million. So similar to the requirements for a family for a voucher, you can make up to 400% of the poverty line set by the federal government. And it's ideally, you know, I think the intent of it is to send lower to mid-income children to private schools. So, and that's been in existence for 15 years. And it started out as a $3 million program, and in 15 years, it's grown 666% to $20 million. But
Shanda, if you live in Panora,
yes,
so that's a rural area. Is there access to these kind of schools like what exists in urban districts?
yes, that's what makes particularly like Guthrie County unique. We don't have access to any public schools, or private school, excuse me. So in the state of Iowa, I believe the statistic is 73% of Iowa school districts, we don't even have access to a private school to spend a voucher. So in my opinion, this bill really does nothing to help our rural school students. Rural schools, they're the heart and soul of our communities. It's what makes Iowa so unique on a national scale. It's what makes Iowa the leaders in education, is having these intelligent and successful farm kids. And rural schools right now, they're struggling to hire teachers, and it's leaving classrooms without teachers. And this voucher bill, it takes more resources away. It tells our rural school students, you know, we're gonna give you an investment, but it's not the investment of what it used to be. We're gonna share this investment now with a private entity. And it's a private entity that you may not have any access to at all. It's an entity that can fundraise to hire a teacher. It's an entity that can fundraise to hire the next best football coach. And I think that's what it really boils down to, is you're having two different sets of rules. And if we're all going to pull from the same set of money, then we all should be playing by the same set of rules. To Rose's point, fair is fair.
Like Representative Wills said, in the 70s when they changed how Iowa schools are funded to it being equal across the board, so it's not like a local rural schools, private property taxes are only going to their schools, it all goes to one pot. And so if they're pulling what starts as $55 million for a voucher program, but we've seen in every other state that grows, that's money that's not going to be available to spread out over all of our public schools.
Well, and it reminds me of an example that we just heard about funding. So, you know, the legislature has passed a 2.5% increase for public schools, but that leaves 48 of our 327 schools still making cuts. Because 2.5%, while it's an increase, isn't keeping up with the cost of living in Iowa. And a lot of schools and a lot of local economists might disagree that that's the right number.
Well, and even to clarify that further, sorry, that those 48 school districts are actually getting less money. So like not even like accounting for inflation, they're getting less money because we fund per child. So, you know, one family with 4 children moves out of the area and they've lost all of that money. And so they're truly looking at a budget cut.
Mm-hmm. When you look at a 7.5% inflation rate, perhaps some might say that 2.5% is a cut.
Well, exactly. Many more schools than just those districts are going to make budget cuts because their costs are going up.
Okay, we are going to continue our conversation, ladies, but we're going to move on to the workforce and how education impacts Iowa's workforce, which we know is such a big problem right now. So we'll explain the correlation next. Continuing our discussion with parents for great Iowa schools. Once again, we are here with Louisa Dykstra. Louisa.
A tricky county.
It is. Rose Green and Shanda Karstens, thank you so much again. As we discuss workforce and the correlation between education and workforce, why is that an important, Louisa, conversation to have?
Well, the number one thing you hear from any business leader in Iowa right now is that they're struggling to find workforce. And the solutions that have been proposed so far all tend to be sort of at the end of the line. Like they're talking about how do we provide more of the post-secondary education, help more kids be involved in that. But that sort of feels like the frosting, and the cake is our public school system. So we, like Representative Wills was talking about, funding children, and obviously, you know, we all started advocating for our own kids at our own school buildings, and then realizing, like, oh, like even our own school board doesn't have control over the funding that happens at the legislature. So that's when we got into what is the bigger picture for all of Iowa's kids. So really, we need businesses to sort of engage with those public schools. Like a business leader needs to be concerned about, is every kid have access to preschool, you know, and just sort of starting at the beginning and setting that foundation.
And educating that pipeline and not starting in their junior or senior year of high school, but investing in them earlier.
Because 94% of students are in public schools. So we can, you know, if you want to fund private schools all you want, there's still 94% of the students in our state in public schools.
Huge piece of our workforce comes from the public schools.
Right.
Right.
And it used to be that Iowa had the reputation for the best schools in the country, and I think that a lot of people wanted to come back to Iowa to raise their families, and that obviously provided a workforce pipeline just because of people wanting to live in Iowa, and we don't have that reputation anymore. And so I'd love to see business leaders really dig in and saying, what do our public schools need to really meet the needs of every child? That's what we would love to see. That's the conversation we wish we were having, instead of fighting against these bills that we feel like are making it harder for public schools. We'd love to say what public schools are doing really well, and how can we look at what's going well, and how can other schools duplicate that, and what resources do they need to make a difference. That's what the conversation we wish we were having.
And there are so many great examples throughout the state that public schools are doing, not just to take care of their youngest children, but to educate them as they transition to post-secondary. But a lot of that is legislation, and it's legislation that's not funded. Future Ready Iowa is a great program, and we wish that we could spend more time advocating for that, but we would advocate for actually funding some of the great ideas that are in it. It's grossly underfunded.
And I would like to point to, you know, Future Ready Iowa is an initiative, a Republican initiative. this is not a partisan conversation that you ladies want to have.
No, I mean,
not
in
at all.
fact, Future Ready Iowa had a huge impact on our own family. My youngest daughter was able to get her CNA through our local assisted living home and do a marketing internship, and that's what she's going to go study at Iowa State now. Like, it had a huge impact. It's an amazing program. So thankful for the governor to be able to pass something like that.
The interesting thing about Future Ready Iowa is there were 5 parts of that when that was rolled out. And the 4th part just basically said, we need to make sure that our K-12 schools are functioning well. Like, no detail, no specifics, that's, to me, that's the meat of it. And there hasn't been any emphasis put there.
It shows that you can't pass that policy without incorporating K-12 education. And again, back to your 94%, that's the super majority of our future workforce.
And when you say, you brought up that story of how things are working some places, there are so many good public school stories to tell and to share that would help to lift these public schools up if you had the opportunity instead of fighting.
Right.
Yes.
We hear them every day. We all have graduating seniors, and so it's really exciting to see where all of these children have come since kindergarten and their pursuits beyond. And we've actually started a Public School Proud campaign because we want to combat some of that negativity with the great stories. And we just recently published one about a student and about a teacher. And if anyone wanted to share them with us, they could find us
On Facebook
on
is the easiest
Facebook.
place.
That's probably the easiest place to submit a story.
What's maybe one that jumps out to you?
Well,
Excuse me, I'm so sorry. That is the end for us. Thank you so much, ladies, for the conversation. We'll take a short break. You're watching This Week in Iowa. Thank you so much for joining us here for This Week in Iowa. If you would like to follow along with some of those positive stories coming from Des Moines Public Schools and schools from across our state, you just have to search Parents for Great Iowa Schools on Facebook. And of course, we have a podcast. Don't forget to download it. Have a great weekend, everybody.